welcome you all to this meeting in the Indo-Norwegian Research Partnership. And in particular, I would like to welcome our Indian friends who have traveled very far. Actually also brought a bit of summer into Norway. The theme of today's conference is business contribution towards growth and sustainable development in India. I think this is a very important topic, and we are lucky today to have gathered a group of very good scholars, and we're going to present some interesting research findings. The conference is organized into 3 different sessions. First, there will be 25 minutes with a general reflection on the importance of building research partnership with India and Norway. And the 2 gentlemen over here will also give a few remarks. And then we will have a session on promoting better markets to achieve robust growth targets. And then there will be a short break. And after the break, we will have a session on effective regulation for business to achieve sustainable development goals. I will chair this first session, and then Kemane will chair the second session. I think some of you know each other, but since we're such a small group of people, I suggested to take just a brief round around the table to present ourselves. My name is Ulf Sverdrup. I'm the director of NUPI, and Arne maybe.
Yes, I'm Arne Melchior. I'm a senior research fellow at the Department for International Economics here at NUPI.
My name is Bimal Arora. I work with Center for Responsible Business in India, and I've been involved in a research project, this corporate conduct, business regulation and corporate conduct, as an advisory capacity.
My name is Anthony Miller. I work for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva. There I'm the focal point on corporate social responsibility issues.
Hi, good morning. My name is Rijit Sengupta, and I'm a director at CUTS. I'm involved with the work on business regulation and corporate conduct.
Hello, good morning. I'm Divya, and I'm the program manager with the Center for Responsible Business. And I'm presently involved in research with the Ministry of the Netherlands, around similar issues. So,
Good afternoon to all. Myself Uday Mehta. I'm an associate director working with CUTS and also leading the project on competition and regulation in India.
Ivar Pettersen from the Norwegian Agricultural Economics Research Institute, where I have a position as senior research fellow.
I am Guru. I'm a master's student at UMB studying international development studies.
My name is Gunhild Øye. I'm working in Ecolabel, responsibility regarding the Nordic Swan and EU-uppdrag.
My name is Gibran. I've just finished a master's in South Asian Studies from the University of Oslo.
Good day, my name is Harriet Reisen, and I'm also a master's student, still a master's student, at the South Asian program with the University of Oslo.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm a communications center operator at the Norwegian Joint Headquarters.
My name is Vinod Mishra. I'm working at the National Hospital here in Oslo, Norway, and I've been involved with our Prime Minister vaccination program and research program.
I'm Tom Reinegdal. I'm an associate professor at the Norwegian Business School, and I've been involved in the competitive acquisition regulation in India project together with 2 of my colleagues as well. Please.
My name is Irina Sandra. I'm the founder of Entering India, and right now I'm writing a book on the new India. That's why I'm here.
My name is Amit Srivastava. Earlier I was at NUPI for past 13 years. Currently I'm affiliated to the University of Bergen.
My name is Eivind Spur. I'm Director of Research at the National Institute of Consumer Research in Oslo. I've also been involved in a project about textile standard, textile labeling together with CUTS.
I'm Unni Kjernes, senior researcher also at CIFO, and I'm involved in several projects with CUTS on textiles and on food security.
Yeah, my name is Christian Riis. I'm a professor at the Business School here in Oslo. So with Leila and Espen, we have worked on this project together with CUTS.
Yes, so my name is Espen Moen. I'm a professor at
at the Norwegian School of Business with teaching and online. And as they've said several times, we've been working on this project.
Okay. Hello everyone. I'm Kaya Adrian, working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with trade and sustainability and negotiating on trade and environment within the WTO.
My name is Shyam Khimani. I'm filling in for Pradeep Mehta, but I also serve as an advisor to CUTS. And previously, I was the advisor on competition policy and regulatory reform in the World Bank group in Washington, D.C., where I continue to reside.
Okay, thank you so much. A nice group of people, diverse backgrounds. Just let me also say that Jens Anvik has been involved in cooperation with us for quite some time. He unfortunately could not participate. His old mother is in bad health, so he had to travel on short notice, and he apologized very much for not being here. So that pretty much rounds up the presentation. Now let me say a few words about the significance of partnership and partnership between Norwegian and Indian institutions in general. I think the starting point for NUPI at least is a very simple one. The first observation is that in order to do good research, we need to shape and develop international cooperation and partnership in general. And this is becoming particularly important since we observe significant shifts in economic powers, economic and political powers and influence. And so we need to hook up and to find new partners. And for us at NUPI, the BRICS countries, the emerging powers, are particularly interesting. And for quite some time, we have worked rather strategically and we've been giving quite a lot of priority to develop our ties with India and Indian partners. And therefore, I would like to very much thank our friends at CUTS for a long-standing cooperation. It started already in 2005, and for NUPI, CUTS has been very important in bringing NUPI to India, and it's also been a door opener for our activities in India. So thank you so much for this. At the intellectual level, CUTS has also been an interesting partner. It is an NGO with a focus on economics and trade, and it has a strong network in the Indian and international research community. And the cooperation between NUPI and CUTS has involved several projects. The first project was called Granite. And this was later evolved into a Granite 2. These two projects were funded by the embassy, the Norwegian embassy in Delhi. Now, later on, NUPI has also been involved in the BRCC program, and they also been part of the ProSAIC project. Also BI and CIF have been involved. And today we will hear some of the results from this ProSAIC project. From 2012, the structure, as you know, the funding has changed. So the money is not kind of flowing from the Norwegian embassy directly, but it's flowing via the research council. It's not flowing as such. Small drips. But luckily NUPI has been successful in obtaining funding in 3 such projects. And this includes one with CIFO, and where also CUTS is involved in the data collection and dissemination. So this, I think, proves well for further cooperation. The NUPI projects that we run within the Nord Global framework also include other Indian research environments in the university and the institute sector in India. As such then now, I think that we are at the NUPI at the stage where we're getting beyond the kind of critical mass in terms of scholars working on India. Our team has engaged in a broader range of activities, and we have quite a bit of research activities going on. The group is also multidisciplinary, so it brings together economists with political scientists and sociologists. So the person are Svein Sundsted Eriksen, Francesca Jensenius, Jens Anvik, as you know, Karl Reich, and Arne Melchior. That's kind of our India team, so to say. So for us, at UP, we aim at further developing and strengthening our research on India, and also to further develop our ties and partnership with Indian groups. So again, I would just like to thank CUTS for taking NUPI to India and for helping us. And let me also take this opportunity to congratulate you with your 30th anniversary this year. And we are of course sorry that the CUTS leader, Mehta, could not be here, but I get pretty sure that you will represent CUTS as well. So we look very much forward to this meeting. So now I think I give the floor to you, and you can say a few words.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and back in Oslo after many years. My work with the World Bank and prior to that with the Government of Canada in the competition policy field brought me to Oslo, especially when Norway was formulating its competition law, and Inar Hapa, who was then a professor at Bergen School of Business, became the first head. Let me first convey Pradeep Mehta's regrets of not being here in person. He asked me to fill in for him. Let me give you a little bit of a background about CUTS. CUTS stands for Consumer Unity Trust Society, which was founded more than 30 years ago, as Pradeep quite fondly remarks, in a garage, and started off with a newspaper, a wall newspaper called Gram Gadar, which is published still today, and I guess it is pasted on walls so that the poor people who cannot otherwise afford newspapers have access to the news. CUTS has been active in protecting and promoting and advocating consumer rights and consumer sovereignty. From its small roots in Calcutta, it has evolved into a transnational NGO, one of the few that one can see on the horizon in this particular field. Of course, we have Oxfam and CARE and other such NGOs. But in the area of competition policy, consumer rights, CUTS stands out. The work that they have done spans 40 countries, mostly across Africa and Asia. They have now representative offices in Hanoi, in Lusaka, in Geneva, and soon to be one in Accra, and I think I'm missing out one location.
Nairobi.
And in Nairobi, through the generous funding, even though it may, the flow may be reduced somewhat, but through the generous funding of the Norwegian Embassy in Delhi, the Prosaic project was launched, which stands for Poverty and Sustainable Development and Inclusive Development. And so that's the project, the reports of which are going to be reported on today. There are, I believe, 3 projects on that. One is on exploring the interplay between business regulation and corporate conduct in India. The second one is on the study of environmental standards and their trade impact on Indian textiles and clothing sector, and then competition and regulation in India, and also more broadly. As these topics indicate, these are not only very topical, but these are burning issues that are confronted in India, but also in many other developing countries. So the results of these studies and some of the conclusions and lessons to be drawn hopefully will have a wider application than just India. So with that, thank you again, and look forward to the proceedings this afternoon.
Yes. Yes, well, first let me thank NUPI for organizing this and inviting us and to people from CUTS to come here, and long way from India, and to organize the event. So I'm sorry if my speech is a bit blurry, but I have to go to the dentist and I had to get anesthetics and try to really to struggle against it, but the pain was too much, so I had to give in.
for Norway, a country like India is of course very big. So in India's population of close to 1.2 billion people, we are 5 million in Norway. The growth rate in India has been very high in the last 10-15 years. And not only that, also English is the language spoken in the labor force. And Norwegians, we are not sort of generally not very good with languages, but most of us speak English reasonably well. So that makes business much easier. Also, you are a democracy, like we are, and you are also a secular state, which also makes business more easy. And of course, your service sector is very impressive. You have a high-tech industry that's huge and dominating in the world, and you are one of the biggest players in the world in that sector. But of course, collaboration. To get collaboration between Norway and India, to get business to flourish, you need knowledge. And the best way of getting knowledge is, I think, through research, to joint research programs. And therefore, we've been very happy that we have been part of the project competition and regulation in India. And we are in particular, we have been looking at telecom regulations in India. And we've also been in India and on a conference there and discussed these issues with you. And I think this has been very valuable to us. We have learned a lot, and hopefully also it's going to be both ways. So we had a revise and resubmit on the paper in this book, which was then finally published, and we got a lot of comments. Actually, it was kind of, some of them were a bit, not harsh, but they were very polite, but not always so easy to deal with. But we learned a lot from it, and I think it improved the paper a lot. So thank you for that. Yeah, so if you're looking at sort of which areas of business are Norway particularly strong at, and where can we think that it would be very natural to have collaboration? Well, in telecommunication, we have already, Norwegian firms are already investing heavily in India. But you can also think of other industries like renewable energy. You are growing very quickly. You have huge demand for energy, and as Norway and the Norwegians, we are very concerned with environmental issues, and we know that India is that as well. So therefore, if some of this energy could be renewable energy, that would be a very good thing. And here you can think that you can have collaboration, like on solar energy, and maybe particularly on hydropower, where we have a lot of experience. Also, the maritime sector is very important for Norway. We have long traditions within shipping. That's sort of built sort of Norwegian industrial society 100 years ago. It's still very important, both shipping directly and also indirectly towards oil drilling and supply ships to oil. So that's also a place where we think that we can have things in common. Also, offshore, more generally, we are a leading player in offshore oil drilling, as I said. We have almost 50% of the world market. So that's another area where we could collaborate. And last example I have here is farms. Or generally, you may think fisheries. Norway has a long tradition for fishing. First, it was sort of the natural way, but then we have these fish farms, and they are world leading on when it comes to fish farming. And we may think that can also be an interesting area where we could collaborate. So, but all these areas, almost all these areas somehow involve natural resources. And natural resources, that has its own logic when it comes to economics. Natural resources somehow typically have to be regulated, because there is not, because you don't always have well-functioning property rights for those resources, and then you have to create them. Like, for instance, when it comes to the spectrum in telecommunication, this we wrote about, that is a limited resource, and you have to allocate that in an efficient way on all the users. That's what we write about. But that's also true for all the other for other natural resources as well. So therefore, this is sort of an area where, in order to get efficient allocation of resources and efficient business environment, we need research. And these are also the areas that we have been working with quite a lot here in Norway. And therefore, we are very happy that we were allowed now to do research on this in India. And together with CUTS, that was very valuable. As I said, when we got this revised institution, we got a lot of inputs. And also, more generally, that for us to learn to know the system in India, it is crucial, I would say, really crucial to have a partner in India, so that we can get the information floating, so that we can know that our analysis is relevant. Yes, and more generally, sort of understanding how to do the business environment vary from country to country, both sort of in terms of economics and in terms of sort of business culture. And that's sort of at BI, that's our speciality, sort of economics, understanding the economics of the business in different countries, but also other aspects of the business, of doing business. Therefore, we again think that we have a lot of common grounds with CUTS, and we're happy with the collaboration. Yes, that was what I had to say.
Excellent. Good. Okay, I don't know if we should, do we have some other questions or remarks? Thank you so much for your introductions. Should we see any comments, reflections, additions, subtractions? Okay, then I suggest that we move on in the program. No, I think that if it's important for you, I don't know, but if it's important for you, CUTS or whether that this is free or not made available, then I'm informed that when we talk without a microphone, it makes no sense. So if we should, if Jock over here should continue to film, we should use that microphone. So I don't know if that impairs the quality of the negotiations or discussions here, then we shouldn't do it, I think. But if it's important, we should use that microphone. Okay, but then I think I just give the floor to you, and then you can take a show from now on. Thank you.
Okay. I don't have any slide presentation.
Only in the first stage.
Yeah. No, I'll be very brief. I don't think it's even worth recording, but still I'll be very brief. I've been asked to chair the session as well as be a discussant. And so I'm going to take the chairman's prerogative and not say anything until I hear the other discussants, and then try to add into the discussion there. So the first session is on the competition and regulation publication, and it has 10 chapters, 9 of which are substantive, and they cover a broad range of subject areas, ranging from issues of political economy or regulation and vested interest groups to something very specific like telecom regulation. So we have a rich menu for discussion, and I think what we also have is a rich agenda for actions, policy actions that CUTS and hopefully NUPI can act as a catalyst for furthering the dialogue and ensuring there's greater policy coherence and consistency in the areas that are being reviewed. So with that, I would like to call upon the first person on the program, to present their views.
So is somebody controlling the slides?
You got the remote.
Thank you. Thank you, Shyam. Good afternoon to all. The way the session has been structured is primarily I'm going to speak about ICRR, which is Competition and Regulation in India. It's a program which we have been running since 2007. So what I'm going to basically talk about is why we started this whole project and this program, what were the initiators and the triggers which led CUTS to launch a program in 2007, and we've continued the journey, which in a way kind of culminates today with the release of the 2011 report, but we don't intend to stop here, we intend to continue. After my presentation is done, I'll have my colleague and our partner from BI speaking more in details about their involvement in the project and specifically on the telecom chapter. With that, let me begin my presentation. Basically, my presentation has been outlined. I'll give you a quick background on what were the triggers for us to launch this competition and regulation in India, the project. Having said that, I'll talk about the need for the study, what are the objectives of this project and the program. And then I'll talk about what has been the scope of the report 2007, and then we came out with the report in 2009, and then 2011. And then I'll basically end with a quick snapshot of all the three reports, what we did cover in the journey from 2007 to 11, and then I'll end with some examples of what has been the implications or the outcomes of the project at the policy level in India. At CUTS, we do lay a lot of emphasis on outcomes are more important than outputs. It's good to have reports, but we don't feel satisfied if the reports don't result in certain actions at the policy level. So I'll give you a very quick example of certain policy implications which have been triggered as a part of this journey since 2007. So the background, why did we start the project Competition and Regulation India? I take you back to the history, which was in the area during the pre-1991 economic reforms. Some of you might be aware of the fact that it was in 1991 that India launched the economic reforms. Post 1991, it was a license-controlled economy where there was not prioritization. It was being big was not looked upon positively. Everything was tightly controlled by the state governments and the central government. So it was in 1991 that we adopted market-oriented policy reforms, which led to liberalization, increase in investments, and foreign players being allowed to enter into certain markets, though that large number of other markets still remain pretty tightly closed in India. Given that we also had some changes in our competition regime in our country, pre-1991 we had this Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act which came in 1969. It was post-1991 that we realized that we cannot continue having the MRTPC Act for one big reason, that the MRTPC Act approach was more structural. In sense, if you are big, you are bad. Making profits was always a dirty word. So given the changes in the economic reforms and given that we were liberalizing and we also wanted to grow, we also wanted to have a new Competition Act which comes in place, which does not look upon being bad as being big is bad, but however being abusive in being in a big position is bad. And that was the reason why in 2002, we passed a new Competition Act. And one of the biggest changes was in terms of the approaches of the Act, that in the MRTPC Act, it was more structural approach, whereas in the Competition Act in 2002, it moved on from being a structural approach to more of a behavioral approach. So that was, the change was in tandem to the economic reforms which was adopted by the Indian government. So, need for the study. What we realized was that given the fact that their policy is a dynamic, things are changing on a regular basis. However, in India, what we realized was there was no periodic review to assess what has been the functioning of the markets in those countries. What are the implications of those various policy reforms which are taking in the markets? There was no periodic review which was being undertaken. So keeping that in mind and keeping the fact that governments, whether at the central level, and given that India is of a federal structure, we also have a lot of powers being given to state governments. So there are reforms which are adopted at the central level and there are reforms which are being adopted at the state level. So having said that, the important fact which we wanted to also analyze, that there could be distortions in the market which could be influenced by certain policies. There could be policies in place which might have an anti-competitive effect or could lead to anti-competitive effect in the market. And then there are practices when we take a look at or we evaluate the markets that there could be certain anti-competitive practices which are prevalent. So anti-competitive practices could have been led either by policies or it could have been led by practices. So given all this, what we realized was it's extremely important for us to do a biennial review of certain markets and try and see what has been the impact of certain decisions at the market level in terms of how the companies are behaving, how competitive are the markets, are consumers enjoying the benefits of those reforms or not. So this was the background which led Kutch to design this program, Competition and Regulation India, with the purpose that we would do a biennial review of certain economic sectors and try and understand what has been the impacts of competition or the lack of competition in those certain markets and use the evidence to undertake policy making. That's been our ethos of the organization, that we use evidence-based policy making. So one of the objectives of the competition regulation reports throughout this journey has been to come out with evidences which we can then use to engage with the Competition Commission of India or to engage with relevant government stakeholders to bring about certain policy changes and also to engage with players in the market to bring about certain practice changes. So that was the background which led us to design this project, which is Competition Regulation in India. What were the objectives of the ICRR? The first and foremost, as I mentioned, that we would like to continue this as a program of undertaking a biennial review. Every 3 years we would like to do, or every 2 years we would like to do a review of what has been the status of the reforms on the markets, how has been the performance of the industries, whether the consumers are enjoying the benefits of better competition or not. So that was one of the main objectives or triggers of having this program in place. Second most important, which I did mention, that we also would wanted to bring together evidence, which is basically primarily doing research in form of a compendium and then producing it as a report and putting it across to our policymakers, which can then be taken up by the policymakers when they are taking certain policy decisions. Third, as part of this project, we do one thing. We have been doing one interesting aspect. We have undertaken a competition perception survey since 2007, 2009, and 2011. This is a survey of close to 600 to 700 informed stakeholders on aspects of competition and regulation in certain economic sectors. The basic purpose of undertaking this survey was to try and understand what is the understanding, the awareness of the stakeholders on competition issues in India. And the stakeholders comprises of people from media, from small-scale industries, civil society organizations, and media. And we have been mapping what has been the change in terms of awareness and understanding of the stakeholders since 2007, 2009, and 11. Last but not the least, as I did mention, that whatever we do have this intention of bringing about some policy changes. So the recommendations in the report are oriented towards policy reforms in whether it's in economic sectors or whether it's in the economy at a larger level. So evidence is extremely important. That's been the ethos of undertaking the research, but that results in policy implications. The scope of the reports. Primarily the structure of the reports and the scope of the reports have primarily been kept coherent since 2007 and 9 and 11. To begin with, first we have been doing analysis of certain specific sectors to understand what has been the implications at the policy level and to also try and map what has been the implications on policies vis-a-vis the practices in certain markets. Second, we have been undertaking the review of the Competition Act and specific sector regulations. There are certain sector-specific laws, and then in India we have this whole mushrooming of sector regulators who are also mandated to promote competition. So one of the purposes is also to analyze what has been the effectiveness of these institutions vis-a-vis the Competition Act and vis-a-vis the relevant sector regulators. Third, competition issues has been the key. As I said, that since all the three reports, the primary focus has been to understand what are the implications on competition in the market and benefits of competition to the consumers. And that has been the basic ethos of all the three reports. And last but not the least, as I mentioned, is to also do a review and awareness of competition issues. As part of the projects, apart from doing a report, we have also been engaging with the stakeholders. We've been organizing workshops, seminars within various parts of India to try and raise the ante on issues related to competition so that we also get more informed stakeholders in the debate. We would not like to restrict the audience only to the capital city of Delhi, but also try and bring in stakeholders from the various parts of India. India is huge, and it's just not only comprised of states from Delhi and stakeholders from Delhi who are far more better informed, but the purpose of this report has also been to bring together stakeholders from the state level so that we can broaden the horizon and the scope of the stakeholders who could be involved in the policy process and policy decision making. So that has been primarily the objective of the 3 reports since 2007. I'll just quickly give you a snapshot of what 2007 report was about, and then 2009, and then 2011. 2007 report basically covered certain general chapters, which was trying to talk about issues related to competition policy in law. It was the first report, so we were trying to demystify certain issues for the stakeholders, in sense, what does competition policy law really means? And there were certain aspects of the law. We also did a very critical review of the Indian competition law vis-a-vis what are the changes which are required in the law, given the fact that the economy is growing and there are certain provisions in the law itself which required certain amendments. Apart from the general chapters which had more focus on competition issues, we also looked at certain sectoral chapters such as telecommunication, electricity, and we also analyzed the social sectors such as health and education. As an outcome of this report, there were 2 or 3 key recommendations. There were many more which obviously I cannot speak given the paucity of time. But one of the important recommendations which emerged from the report was the need to adopt a national competition policy in India. At this stage, usually we have been advocating for in most of the countries that you need to have a sound policy in place, whether you have a law or not. As you all would agree, the policy has far more implications. It's much wider as compared to just having a law in place. In India, we do have a Competition Act since 1969, but as of now, I speak with you, we still don't have a competition policy in place. And that was one of the key recommendations which emerged from 2007. And as a part of our advocacy agenda, we have been continuing to engage with the government of India and the stakeholders, the industry associations, on why do we need to adopt a national competition policy in India. Second most important was there were certain specific sectoral regulatory issues which are important to be adopted. And one of the things which we did suggest, in India, the way things have evolved, especially in terms of sector regulators, I said in most of our economic sectors, we are having these sector regulators which are coming in, but there's no coherent approach towards regulatory reforms in our country. We find that most of the sector regulators which are coming up in terms of the powers being given to them, in terms of their functioning, in terms of the independence, in terms of their financing, in terms of the powers, the approach has been extremely ad hoc. So one of the key recommendations which we emerged and which resulted in, which I'll be talking in my slide on policy implications, was a draft regulatory reform bill which was designed by the Planning Commission of India, with the purpose of having a more coherent approach to regulations in India so that we have institutions which work in tandem and they have the same set of powers, the same set of, in a way, of structures of independence and functioning. Last but not the least, we also analyzed that there's a need to build capacity of our regulators. We do engage with the Competition Commission of India and sector regulators, and what we do realize in terms of capacity, it's a challenge. And if we really want these institutions to perform, we need to give them resources. We need to have resources in terms of building the capacity of the staff members who are heading these institutions. So that was another important recommendation which emerged, that we need to build institutions, but we also need to create capacity within those institutions. It's not only effective to have a sector regulator in place, but it's extremely important to also have human resources and financial resources which can effectively help the organization to run. In 2009 report, There was a change in our approach from 2007 to 2009. As I mentioned, 2007 was more broad approach on issues related to competition policy and law. Whereas in 2009, we realized that apart from competition reforms, it's also important to focus on regulatory issues. And one of the important changes was our focus on looking at certain key economic sectors. So having done 2007 report was more macro, looking at competition reforms at a larger level. But 2009 report, we focused more on looking at the importance of economic regulations. And we covered certain important sectors such as civil aviation, ports, power, and higher education. Some of the important recommendations which emerged from the study and having done a competition impact assessment as part of the report, I can talk about one or two important recommendations which emerged and we have been trying to advocate with the government of India. In the case of higher education, as of now I speak with you, we have the problem of multiple regulatory agencies in place. And what we've been trying to advocate with the government that we need to bring them together and have either an apex regulator or one regulator rather than having 3 or 4 regulators, because that leads to resource constraints and then also leads to forum shopping between the players. So that was one of the important recommendations which emerged, that we need to consolidate the regulators which we have in higher education and bring together one apex regulator, and also having some state approach in terms, because India is huge, you just cannot have a regulator only sitting in Delhi. So we also spoke about the fact that we need some benches at a state level. In terms of the civil aviation, what I'm happy to report that in 2009, we did recommend that the sector should be opened up to foreign players. And as I speak to you now, the government of India has allowed 49% investment through FDI in the civil aviation sector. And recent news which we read, and I'm sure most of us read in the papers, was this tie-up between Air Asia and Tata to launch a new airlines in India. So that was one of the recommendations which emerged in 2009, and we are happy to see that finally it has been accepted, and we can actually now see more competition in the sector with foreign entry of foreign players in the sector. And I'll just give you a quick brief about the 2011 report. I will not go into details. As I mentioned, my colleague, Professor Christian Rees from BI, will be speaking more about the report. 2011 report continues with the focus of having the sector approach from 2009 and 2011. And in terms of the 2011 report, the important change in this was this project, as we all know, was funded by the Royal Norwegian Embassy, whereas 2007 and 9 report was funded by the British High Commission. So this was a report which we did jointly together with the BI, and BI had contributed a chapter on the telecom regulation. So as part of this report, we did cover certain important economic sectors such as microfinance institutions, natural gas, real estate, retail distribution, and public and telecom sector. So this is the report which copies of it will be released today, later in the day. Impact at the policy level. In my beginning, I did mention the fact that as an organization, we are more keen in terms of what are the policy changes we can bring about through the evidence or the research which we undertake in these reports. We are not satisfied with the fact that we have a fancy report lying on the shelf, but we would like to see what changes we can bring about in the policy. There are a couple of 2 or 3 which I have been able to touch upon in this presentation today. 2007 report contributed and provided inputs in a planning commission of India had come out with an approach paper on economic regulation. This was triggered by a request by the Prime Minister's office that we need to bring together a coherent approach on economic regulations in India. And the Planning Commission was mandated to bring about a paper on how we can bring about more coherence in regulatory reforms in our country, and given the fact that there are various sectors, regulators which are mushrooming in the country. So this 2007 report, a lot of the inputs was fed into the approach paper which was designed by the Planning Commission of India. The outcome of the Planning Commission's paper was this draft regulatory reform bill, which was produced, again, cuts through the reports 2007 and 2009, was able to contribute quite a lot in this draft law, which basic objective is to bring about coherence in terms of creating institutions, regulatory institutions in India. So these has been, and the last which I've already touched upon, is to have a need to have a draft national competition policy. As I speak with you, we have a draft policy which is in place. It is yet to be adopted, but we have been able to bring about the change working since 2007, and it's in 2013 that we are able to see at least a draft document which has been put in place, and we are confident and we are hopeful by the end of this year we should have the draft national competition policy passed and approved by the government. So these are the few implications in terms of the policy level implications from the report and the journey since 2007. This is just a slide where all the 3 reports, all our publications are available online. So if anybody would like to access these publications, the links are provided here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a wonderful overview. And I'd like to now call on Professor Christian Rees.
Where's the computer?
Over there.
Yes. Du kan komme nå. Nei, du må ta den rette. So, give her a minute to find the right presentation. I think you understand it. It's only one about India. Okay, let's. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation. This has certainly been a very interesting collaboration with CUTS. As we told you, our part of this project was actually about telecom, the telecom sector, and in particular on telecom regulations. And as a Norwegian, it was a quite new experience to actually try to get an overview of a market consisting of more than 1 billion people. We are used to discuss much more on what we consider as a macro level is certainly a micro level compared to India. Currently, they have more than 900 million subscribers. Might be they have already passed 1 billion. They are? Yes, right. This was in 2011. So some new thousands during my speech. So it's certainly an extremely dynamic market. And since it's a quite new market, almost all connections are wireless. The growth rate, we have mentioned, they are the highest in the world. And an important part of this is that it's very strong competition. It's in most areas about 10 or more than 10 providers of telecommunication services competing. And as we all know from market theory, with fierce competition, prices goes down. So a lot of the surplus is actually ends up with the consumers. So basically, it's a kind of a success story. You know, as we were told that 20 or some 25 years ago it was an economy which are more kind of had this socialistic planning kind of organization. Now it's a much more dynamic market economy. But still there are some concerns, and that was actually what we then we emphasize in our contribution. And what we discuss in our chapter is basically three problems, three different areas. It's the allocation of spectrum licenses. As Espen mentioned, the spectrum resources are important. It's a natural resource, it's scarce. And if it's not treated or regulated or organized in the proper way, there's a risk that we end up losing a lot of value. Secondly, there is a fee tax system which is quite a bit different from what we see in other countries. And finally, which I will not go very deep into because it was already mentioned by the previous presenter, the credibility and the transparency of telecommunication policy. Okay, regarding allocation of spectrum rights. So, spectrum is a scarce natural resource, and it's extremely valuable. For those of you who know a little bit about how this is organized internationally, it was basically introduced in the 90s, using a market mechanism to allocate spectrum resources in the United States and also in Europe. And it was quite a surprise that the value of spectrum resources turned out to be extremely high, much higher than expected. Back in the 80s in the United States, spectrum resources were allocated just by a kind of lottery, so just given away. Nobody knew the real value of this. Okay, so in order to obtain efficiency, which basically means that you allocate resources according to their marginal value, you had some kind of alternatives, some substitutes here with regard to institutions. You must either have a market-based initial allocation of resources, which basically means some kind of an auction process, which is now the common procedure in most countries. Or a resale market for these resources. You could think about just give away these resources, and if you have an efficient resale market, the resale market will then, by trading in the resale market, will end up with a final efficient allocation of resources. Or if you can't trade the resources as such, you could trade the owners of the resources by mergers, acquisitions. So there's a market for buying a company that owns the resources. Okay. Currently, as far as we can see, all these markets suffer from inefficiencies. Historically, but it seems that things are changing now. Historically, the initial allocation of spectrum resources was a kind of a administrative procedure, which means that they were hardly allocated efficiently. The problem is that the resale market was not there. It was not legal to trade in spectrum resources. You could not sell the licenses. The licenses were typically linked to the spectrum, and you were not allowed to sell it. So there were no resale market for these resources. And finally, the market for buying companies was a regulated market. You need to be approved if you wanted to merge or buy some other company, and through that get access to these resources. Okay, with regard to the final allocation of resources, either of these would in principle lead to an efficient allocation. They differ a lot with regard to distribution. With a market-based initial allocation of rights, typically the value of this natural resource, the market value of this, is transferred to the government. If you have some kind of administrative allocation, the value not necessarily ends up with the companies. You typically end up with much more entry, and you might have much more competition, such that finally the values are transferred to the consumers. Okay. There is an historic dimension here. If you think about, if you take a more forward-looking perspective, it's quite important that it is established a regime with a market-based or auction-based procedure for allocating resources. But historically, that was not done. So in order to, in a way, adjust for those mistakes, we have today probably inefficient allocation of these resources, and we probably have a inefficient corporate structure. Too many firms with an administrative allocation of resources. You stimulate entry. They compete in order to get access to these values. Who gets access? Well, it might be a kind of random or depend on who knows who. You end up with a structure which is inefficient. So in order to adjust this picture, we also need to establish a resale market and to open up for mergers and acquisitions. Well, Norwegians are typically very focused on natural resources. We know a lot about that. It is a scarce natural resource, extremely valuable. And this rent, which is comparable to the oil rent, petroleum rent in Norway, should be extracted by the government for several reasons. One reason is that this is a non-distorted tax. It's actually you're selling something of value, so the price should be there. So there's not a tax in the standard meaning of the word. And this income to the government can be used to reduce distorted taxes on capital and labor. Secondly, if you do not use the market here, if you don't set the right price on the resources, you'll have too much entry. Firm enters in order to get access to this particular value, which then gives rise to this kind of profitable rent-seeking influence activities in order to come in position. So, to introduce or to extract this rent is important not only because it gives the government an potentially very high revenue, but also to establish a credible and transparent regime without this kind of rent-seeking and influence activities. There are different ways to do this. If you use an auction, which is the standard procedure, the payment, you extract this by an upfront payment. Firms, companies bid for these resources, and the winners get the resources and pay for them up front, which is fine in a industrialized modern economy. It might be a problem in a country or an economy which is in a growth process where new firms enter. To the extent there are financial constraints, it might be a problem for a firm to first buy the resources at a high cost, then invest in infrastructure and technology before they recruit customers and make money in the market. So it could be done through a tax system. Basically, that's what we do in the Norwegian petroleum sector. We extract the oil rent through taxes. It could be a profit tax, as in Norway. In Norway, you pay this additional 50% tax on profit. It could be a license fee. Instead of paying an upfront price for the selected resources, you pay an annual license fee. And if this license fee is set according to the value of the resources, you actually get the same market outcome. What is partly done in India, which is a concern, is the revenue tax that was introduced in the late 90s. A revenue tax might be a concern because two companies pay different taxes. The company with the highest revenue pay higher taxes than the company with small revenues, which could be fine. Certainly, a profit tax works the same way. You pay more in taxes. But the difference between a profit tax and revenue tax is that with a profit tax, you subtract all the costs. Here, you pay a tax based on total revenue, which means that if you're really successful, invest a lot, get a high revenue, you pay a lot of taxes. So it's a kind of a tax on success than a profit tax. In principle, profit tax should be neutral. In principle, a profit tax should be so that all investments that are profitable for the society are also profitable for the company to carry out. With the revenue tax, this result breaks down. Okay. Finally, a few words about transparency and credibility. One particular aspect of the telecommunication industry is that you invest a lot initially. The investments are sunk. You can't take this capital with you. You can't take it out of the country. It's literally installed in the country. Which means that exposed after these investments are sunk, in principle, the investments are quite vulnerable for extraction. In principle, the government could just extract the revenue, more or less. Most governments would not actually do that, of course, for one simple reason: you would never get any more investments in that country. So in order to stimulate investments entry, and in particular then in an industry like the telecommunication industry, the policy must be based on rules, not discretion. It must be credible, it must be foreseeable, it must be such that the company that sees here is a profit opportunity, I can invest and I will be rewarded in the future. And this also means that there are some concerns regarding how the structure of the regulatory regime. This is also mentioned by the previous presenter. With regard to the fee tax system, as we understand, this revenue tax is actually under the control of ministries in charge of telecommunication, not in the Ministry of Finance, which might reduce the credibility of dramatically of this tax system. What do we know about this? If we end up with higher profits in these companies, why shouldn't just the ministry capture it, extract it by higher tax? So this telecom-specific tax system should be abolished, and everything should be integrated into the general corporate tax system in India, and in charge, and the Ministry of Finance should be in charge of these taxes. Okay, I think I stop there. Thank you so much.
Do some of your co-authors want to add anything? Yeah.
I think that this was a good summing up of the report, that it is very important in order to get efficiency that the market can be very flexible, so that it's not so that there is only one way to achieve efficient allocation of resources, but you have to get it has to work properly at least along one dimension, and that has been a problem. And also, I think what Christian also emphasized, that different ways of allocating this scarce resource, the different ways of allocating this scarce resource will have, even though sort of the allocation in the end may be the same, who will get the rent, that may vary. And that's something one should think of. Do you want the sort of the value of the spectrum to end up with the consumers, or do you want it to end up with the government? That depends on how much you trust the government and how the government will most likely use those resources. And then we are back also then on the next, on your last point, which is very important, and that is sort of the commitment of the government. Because you have so huge investments here that are sunk. So if you do the investments in infrastructure, you cannot take it with you back home. They are there. So therefore, it's very important then, in order in the long run to get investors with good ideas from abroad then for them to be willing to invest, also local investors. The system has to be sustainable. The system has to have credibility, so that all the investors believe that really they will get their return. Otherwise, the problem is that if the investors do badly, they go bankrupt, the government will not do so much. If they do well, then suddenly the government, if then they don't trust that they will get the return, then they will get sort of, they don't get the full upside, they get the full downside, and they will invest less. So these issues, I think, they're really important. and something that one should keep in mind when sort of thinking of how the system should be designed. Yes.
In order to continue the discussion a bit before we get to the second discussant on this, I have a couple of questions. First, in each of the designated circles in telecom, there are fairly large number of players, so there's a lot of inter-firm rivalry and competition in the Indian telecom sector. Secondly, 80% of the telecom subscribers are on a pay-as-you-go basis. So they're not locked in to any one particular provider. And I think there's number portability now in India. So they're not locked in from not having number portability issues either. The third is that given the rate of growth in demand for mobile telephone services, does it really matter with competition on the one side, the growth on the other side, as to whether you have your tax system based on revenue taxes versus profit taxes? Because given the revenue taxes, which are based on the rapid growth of revenue, maybe perhaps a more efficient way of collecting tax revenues, and competition would perhaps ensure that the consumer surplus is retained primarily with the consumers and not with the producers. I wonder whether you have any reactions to those comments.
Yes, I have one problem I see is when I say that this story is a success story, it depends on how you evaluate the spectrum of services here. You indicate that in a way that it's ordinary use of telephony, which is the basic product. Most people buy these cards and pay for each conversation they take. But the next step is, of course, to develop the huge set or the spectrum of telecommunication services associated with data and all kind of business activities, value-added services, yes. And the problem here with that might be a concern, of course, that if there are so many companies out there competing really hard, you could think about a situation where they do not have enough, in a way, financial power to be the firms that really take this market and bring in and develop these value-added services. Secondly, with regard to the revenue tax, think about this as a kind of speculation, but think about a company which really sees here that here I can do a real big investment. It's very risky. I don't know if it's a market for these value-added services, but okay, it might be. It might be that it's a big market. It might fail completely. If I invest, we can end up actually in a situation that Espen describes. If I fail, that's fine. Okay, it's not fine. I may go corrupt, but I don't pay taxes. It's a revenue tax. If I actually succeed, I end up with paying a very high tax measured on profit, since I have sunk these huge investments that I cannot actually subtract from the revenue when I pay the taxes. So it might be a concern if we think about the market for value-added taxes, for value-added services, and the future of the telecommunication industry. If the industry is what they do is just to actually sell the ordinary telephone services, we would not be so concerned.
I just
sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I very much agree with what Christian said. And so what you are saying, and that's sort of a market that is really booming. So does it, will the design of the tax system matter very much? Well, it depends, of course, on the tax rates as well. But maybe in some situations it will not matter that much. But still, sort of it's well known from economics, from economic theory and also economic practice, that in some situations it matters. And a profit tax that is sort of neutral in the sense that it will not influence the behavior of the agents. While a revenue tax may do that. Suppose, for instance, that you're thinking of, should I reduce my costs? Or should I use my energy to expand in the market, a new market? If you reduce your costs, that will not necessarily increase your revenues. So if you reduce your cost, you get everything yourself, you don't pay more tax. While if you're going into a new market segment, then you will get more revenues, and then you will have to pay more tax. So that the tax system may distort you from doing the expansionary thing and only do what is sort of cut costs and thereby sort of reduce the dynamics in the market. And as Christian said, one thing is for ordinary mobile telephony that seems to work reasonably well. But if you want to expand into market segments which are more which have actually more value added into it, which can sort of help businesses more by transferring not only voice but also data, then things may change. Then sort of the incentive to do that, to expand into that, may be lower if you have a revenue tax than if you have sort of a profit tax. I don't say that this necessarily will be detrimental, but still it is generally better with a profit tax.
Perhaps we can come back to that point again. Uday, you wanted to say something, and then...
Hello. Yeah, no, just wanted to react to the point on number portability. And Shyam, the point is, it has been introduced in India, but the only problem it's only applicable right now at this stage only in the metropolitan cities. And then there are certain restrictions. For example, if you're a postpaid consumer, then only you can access number portability. If you're a prepaid consumer, you're not allowed, you don't have access to it. And if you're in a package where you are getting a mobile phone and you're paying over installments, you cannot access number portability. So we are still, because India is divided in 22 circles in telecom, so we are still, it's still a distant reality by the time we actually have number portability across pan-India. So we still have to wait for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. There are no doubt lots of competition distortion. Sorry, Amit, you have a question or point, comment?
Hi, this is related to the regulatory reforms in India because one has to look at the political landscape. There is a law, is already well defined, but it is always constantly changed by the economic group of ministers, the EGOM. They are the people who decide every year in there. In the same Telenor, after what we understood, after losing 22 billion Norwegian kroner, we have learned quite a lot. But in the future, still there are so many steps ahead. What we see, the number 900 millions, is not the actual number. When I landed up in Mumbai just 3 weeks ago, I got 3 SIM cards immediately. You know, and before leaving, I threw all of them. But it will be registered till a year. So the real number is not more than around 500 million, which is using every day. So the cutting in the near terms, what we have to look at, two things. First, we have to look the actual number, what transactions are going on. That is good for profit. The second, we must look at the day-to-day politics because the regulatory reforms is going to change again when BJP comes to power. All these the things which have, because India is going through a huge transformation in the modernization process. And what is important for us to understand the codes, daily codes, you know, because once it came that you'll not get the refund on license. Well, fine. The next day, the group of ministers decided we'll do that. So the overturning goes on the face-to-face value every day. How you negotiate with the political, so that is, to understand the regulatory reforms, we have to understand the political interactions, day-to-day basis. And that is very important to monitor. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Can pass it back to me. Maybe we'll come back to these themes after hearing the discussant, and then I'll come back with some questions. Evan, I don't know how to pronounce the last name, Stowe?
Thank you very much. I think I will take one step back. I am not. My competence is not in the telecom regulation. As a consumer researcher, I think I'd have to take one step back and see how I understand this report. Reading the introduction, I think that from the liberalization, the data regulation in the 90s, what you're trying to do here is to find a new regulatory regime dealing with what you mentioned here, and the telecommunication is only one example of this. So my comments deal with in this deregulation and building up a new regulatory regime, what is the voice of the consumers in these regimes? It seems like when economists are talking that there is no need for consumer policy if the competition is fair or free. The voice of consumers is only necessary if there are no real competition. So I think that in the Norwegian setting we have had this discussion for many decades, and I think that in Norwegian competition law the voice of the consumer is one important factor in when you're dealing with the regulation in the market. So I think my question dealing with that, and the reason for that is that cuts as SIFO are also part of the international consumer movement, and within the Consumer International, this has also been a discussion in the 90s, where the Consumer International movement was very liberalistic. When the Seattle conference came 10 years ago or something like that, then suddenly Consumer International shifted the position, and we are more interested in regulating the international trade. So we see that, and Ralph Nader was very active in this aspect. And the reason for this is of course going back to the roots of the consumer movement. And one of the roots is the consumer message from President Kennedy in 1962, when he put it forward to the American Congress in the 15th of March, later becoming the International Consumers Day. 4 fundamental consumer rights put forward in this message. One is the right to safety, the other is the right to choose, the right to information, and also the right to be heard. I think that this is, at least the fourth, is crucial here. So my question to you, how is the organized consumer movement, is any influence in setting up this new regulatory regime? Or is it that we leave this to the competition and the free market to take care of the interest of consumer? I don't think this is the case. I think that the future regulatory regime also need to have the voice of the consumers, and the consumers have many interests, and the economy is only one of them. So I think that dealing, since we have been working with cuts with the textile business, the international textiles regimes is very complicated, from the cotton field to HM in Oslo, and the role of consumer interest in this is crucial. I'm not in a position to say that the consumers has the right, this responsibility to save all the problems in the Asian textile industry. So that heard voices in Norway saying that because this scandal in the accident in Bangladesh, that the consumers should take responsibility when we are buying clothes to save this problem. That is not my position. I think that is not the case, but the consumers has a role to play here. and how this can be defined within this new regulatory regime, I think could be an interesting thing from my point of view. Since I've been asked to have a comment, you must know that this is the way I am looking at this situation here. So I think interesting book to try to find the new regulatory regime, and I think that this is the case not for, and a lot of interesting chapters are dealing with different sectors in India.
Thank you for that. Let me answer part of your question or comment, and then ask Rijit and Uday to provide more in-depth, and others who know more about the Indian system. But basically, there is no one organized voice for consumers in India, as far as I know. Consumer Unity Trust Society is perhaps the one organization that stands out, but acts as a catalyst and an advocate. But for redress for consumer harm, there is a consumer court system in India which works very effectively, to the point that many businesses complain because the consumer court has the right to even subpoena, if that's the right word, but to order the CEO of a company to present himself or herself before the court, and if not, then be subject to contempt. And so one CEO who complained to me in one of my trips was that he's based in a town called Pune, near Bombay, and the consumer court in Gujarat, in the western part of India, had ordered him to show up because the particular vehicle that the consumer had bought turned out to be, faulty, and the warranty was not honored. And so the consumer launched a case before the consumer court, very accessible to ordinary people. And all of a sudden, the CEO had to either find some way of getting a proxy there, or himself go there and present, an argument as to whether they would or would not honor the warranty. Now, can you imagine the president of General Motors, going there? And this CEO was not a small CEO. It is a company that General Motors actually wanted to partner with. And so there is mechanisms in India. India is a very litigious society. And it has a more backlog of court cases in every sphere than most economies have, to the point that it has clogged up the judicial system. So, justice delayed is justice denied, and certainly applies in the Indian context. Coming back to the presentations, what I wanted to point out is that when they outlined this project report and started with the 1991 reforms, what was happening with the 1991 reforms was sort of like a partial movement of trying to integrate the Indian economy into the greater global economy. And at that time, the global economy was certainly growing in terms of trade and investment much more rapidly than the Indian economy was, which was growing at the Hindu rate of growth. And on top of that, had faced a balance of payments problem, to the point that India had only 14 days of foreign exchange reserves to meet its international obligations. That's how close it came to the crisis point when it went to the IMF and the World Bank for assistance. I don't know of any country or any household budget where they have only 14 days left of resources, to meet their obligations. So that acted as a catalyst. But these are partial reforms. What India needs is second and third generation reforms. And even if there was a complete liberalization of trade and investment, we know from experience that that's not enough. It's not international barriers to trade and investment that are preventing growth from taking place. It's also behind the borders barriers. And so this volume actually makes a contribution towards addressing the behind the borders barriers in terms of the lack of a regulatory framework in place. I just glanced through the various chapters, and certainly there is a chapter dealing with stakeholders and political vested interest groups, which in every country, lobbyists are active and try to distort policies or change policies in their direction to favor their particular, interest group. But what the chapters, I think, miss out upon is that even if you were to have the ideal set of regulatory reforms in place in any sector, one also has what we call incumbency advantages. The firms that were already there, that were nurtured in a closeted, closed environment, have more than a first and second and third mover advantage. And what we have found from industrial organization economic theory is that once you have a dominant firm in the market, it takes a very long time to erode that dominant market position. Then the other thing that is not touched upon, though it is there implicit in the telecom chapter, is that the Indian economy is a shortage economy. So when we talk about the infrastructure needs in terms of transportation or water or power, it requires massive amount of investment in order to have the requisite supply of those services in those sectors. So when you liberalize and try to attract investment, say, for example, in the power sector, aside from the incumbent firms having incumbency advantages, it being a shortage economy, how would you allocate the new capacity that is being brought on stream? Now, the conventional economist argument will be, hold auctions. Right? That's what we did with telecom. Forget about the 2G corruption and that crisis for the moment, okay? Let's assume that actually politicians are honest and regulators are intelligent and that they can actually allocate scarce resources through auctions. But as I said, we're dealing in a society where demand far exceeds supply. So we're dealing with a shortage economy. And how will the additional capacity for electricity, for example, be allocated? If you do it through auctions, then the Reliance, the Tatas, the Bharti Airtel, and everybody else, the conglomerates, those who have long purses, have incumbency advantages, have full rights to bid away, and still create scarcity and still have a possibility of actually bidding for monopoly profits. Because after all, it's not every day that you're going to have an auction. So then do you introduce a regulation where you disqualify certain entities from participating in order to mitigate against the incumbency benefits, which would not be sustainable in a democratic society? Or do you put other kinds of regulations like price caps or other forms so as to prevent this kind of gouging? Or how else would you try to safeguard, given particularly in those sectors which have characteristics of a natural monopoly? Not easy questions, I'm just raising them, but I find that in a lot of the discussions on regulation and in India, we tend to gloss over the fact that we're dealing with a shortage economy. So those are some of my comments. I don't want to monopolize the allotted time. We still got about 8-9 minutes or 10 minutes for any additional comments. Please.
So just a very brief comment, raising some very general questions that we will not have time to address. Okay. Yes, I will raise some general questions that we will not have the time to settle in 9 minutes, I think. So, but thanks for this interesting study and report and this contribution on Indian competition and regulation. What I would like to add is that I think competition policy should always be seen in two kind of related contexts. The first is the sectoral pattern of competition and structure, because the impact of regulation depends on the market setting. For example, in some cases for trade in goods, you can have free trade, for example, and that will kind of have much to say for the market outcome, independent of the domestic regulation. So the impact of regulations depends on the market context. trade liberalization, innovation, the technological characteristics of a sector, etc. So that's one thing that I think one always has to see the results in the market context. The second is that the role of business in society depends on the level of development, and that is related to kind of very broad questions about should rich and poor countries have the same regulations. So, for example, to look back to, for example, in Norwegian history, if you take 100 years back, business could play a kind of role for state building. So we allotted trade monopolies to some guys who were being also the banks, and they were probably also exploiting some of the farmers. But they played an important role for the development of these societies. And I think that India is the whole range from advanced capitalism to the rural setting and small villages with different. So I think this kind of development issue is important, and so I would be kind of so it's an important issue whether you should have a kind of blanket prescription about what's the right regulation or whether development matters for the kind of regulation.
Thank you for that. Yes, please.
Thank you for very good presentations, very interesting, and congratulations. I have one comment and some few questions. The first comment is about the first presentation, where you indicate that there is a quite substantial development of institutional arrangements in India, which one would expect, I think, and that the competition policy plays a crucial role in this. I think related to what Arne Melchior just mentioned, I would comment upon what I hear, that you have focused pretty narrowly on competition policy in a situation where you might expect that India had been occupied with the development of its own telecommunication industry, some kind of infant industry concern. And my question is then, is it so that India is really putting the weight on competition policy without these concerns for the development of their own industry? I think if you had gone to Singapore, you would have seen a different approach in this. You know, when you think about the national interest of developing own companies and not only competition. Then a couple of questions. You mentioned that India had the need for a competition policy, but what I perceived is that you already have the competition law. So what is there in addition to the competition law that you were really looking for? What extra is there about the competition policy in addition to the legal framework? I think that we often draw the borderline between what is implemented through the competition legal framework and then the competition law in itself is, I don't know what is really there. And then to Christian Riis and your work, I didn't see that you were talking about infrastructure for telecommunication separately from the services provision, because when you are concerned with the industrial structure, too many operators, I would have imagined that this was a concern about the infrastructure part of telecommunications, not the services provision. And there might even be a pretty important distinction here about the regulation of infrastructure ownership and operations and services provision. So a comment on that. And the last question is about your recommendation about the taxing system, which I perceived as a recommendation for the same kind of taxation of telecommunications as other businesses, industries. But that must be provided that there is a taxation of the natural constraint in itself. Thank you.
Dave, would you like to respond and then Christian after.
Okay, the first question was related to the consumer movement in India, and I think Shyam has already responded, but just wanted to add, as India has had a very rich experience in terms of consumer movement and in terms of the institutions itself. We've had in place institutions right from the district level to the state level and going up till the national level. So in terms of the legal structures, we have institutions which are totally in place. I do agree with Shyam, the fact that we do have a lot of cases which are pending and the institutions are overburdened. But there have been some steps taken in order to reduce the burden, but we still have a long way to go. However, in terms of the provisions in the Act itself, there are various sectoral laws which are in place which do emphasize, which are provisions in the Act itself to engage with the consumers. And for example, in the Electricity Act or the telecom sector, there are committees which have been formed where you have a representation from a consumer organization sitting on the board along with the regulators, even on deciding on matters, especially when important decisions are being taken. So while we have a rich experience in terms of consumer movement in our country, but yet definitely one has to agree that we are not very organized. And there are certain organizations which are well placed who have been engaging in terms of ensuring that consumer representation is taken into consideration when certain policy decisions are being taken. But it's not very effective, and you can count on fingers the number of institutions such as CUTS and others who have been effectively engaging. But in terms of the law, we do have provisions which mandate sector regulators and other regulators to also engage with consumer organizations to take on views when such decisions are being taken. Second interesting point which was raised about the need in terms of whether do we have regulations, keeping in mind that we also need to have development issues, which was raised by Arne. I think we completely agree with that point, and we're not saying that it has to be a brush which has to be taken and you need to impose regulations without considering what are the social, political needs of each and respective country. And we definitely need to understand that one size does not fit all. There are political, economic, social issues which needs to be considered when certain XYZ reform is being proposed. So as a practice in India itself, we've had a rich debate and rich arguments and discussions. As Indians, we're also extremely argumentative. The fact that if regulations have to be imposed, then certain factors have to be kept in mind. And we've had even laws which even exempt the small-scale industries from the purview of the laws. So definitely development is an important issue which is kept in mind when certain regulations or policies are being imposed or are being framed. Regarding the comment made by Shyam, I think it's a very interesting point which has been raised. I don't really think I can react to that point right now. It needs much more deliberations, and I think it needs to be, people like you need to guide us in terms how do we really deal with this issue. As we've already seen in terms of the telecom auction, we have made a mess. We are going to make a bigger mess because we're also talking about auctioning of coal mines in India now. And as we all know, coal is an extremely important natural resource. And I don't know how the experience, given the telecom experience, how effectively we are going to be in terms of auctioning of coal mines is something which is a question mark in most of us who have been working in this area. So it definitely requires more thought and more research to be undertaken in the points which you have raised, Shyam. The last but not the least, would like to react to the point that yes, we do have a law, competition law in place. But however, from our understanding, competition law is a subset of the policy. Competition policy has far more wider ramifications in other important policies such as trade policies, such as fiscal decisions being taken by the government of India. So there are important aspects on why we still need a policy to be in place as compared to law. A law has a very focused purpose in sense it only challenges anti-competitive practices. But there are important policy decisions which are being taken, and from there it has to be perceived and analyzed from a competition perspective. So as an organization, our understanding, we've always been advocating that it's always important first to have a policy in place and then you bring in the law. We have not done the same thing. We've had some examples in a country like Botswana has done it, where they actually adopted after undertaking a proper assessment of what are the needs and regulations, they actually adopted the policy first, and then they framed the law to address issues more at a micro level. So even though we have a law which is effective, but we still have a long way to go, but we still definitely need a policy to be in place. Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any? Yes, just a few comments, Ivar. As I understand it, in most cases, the Indian telecommunication companies are vertically integrated. So there have been recently some network sharing projects, I think, but mostly they're vertically integrated. Okay. One interesting aspect or thing about the auction procedure is that the auction mechanism can be designed to take into account all these issues like incumbency advantages, etc., which is quite common to do. You know, to, for instance, to make to reserve one unit or some capacity for newcomers, or you have some discrimination rules that a newcomer will win unless he's more than 20% below in their bid. You know, things like that. Very common in Europe, very common in the United States to introduce these kind of biased auctions. So that's basically what's nice about the auction mechanism, is that you also you know, whether you should conduct an open auction or a sealed bid auction, those issues have to do with actually what's the goal. So auction is not one thing. Sure. And auction is definitely not something that have to be in favor of the large incumbent companies. Quite the opposite. You can use the auction mechanism to solve that problem, to break up the market. Finally, just a comment to you about the consumer interest. I'm not sure I really got your point, because if I understand you right, there are definitely a lot of relevant externalities here. Health issues, fraud, security, privacy, whatever. And consumers are atomistic, they're not well organized, and they face producers that are strong. So definitely there are several reasons why you should think about consumer rights. But I didn't see what this has to do with the market mechanism. These are externalities, which means that a market which is not, in a way, takes this into account, will not function perfectly well. So we have to introduce some mechanisms to take that into account. So I'm not sure maybe you can explain what your point is.
Yes, but the question about consumer interest is that it's not only a matter of economy, and you can solve some of the economic issues by the market, but we have some other interests, and since we're dealing with sustainability is one of them, and we can call these externalities, but I think that the right to be heard, to have influence in the political process is here vital, and you can do it by of course in Norway you have a consumer council that to some degree are representing the consumers when all topics are on the agenda, and we have consumer laws. The right to redress is one of the fundamental question, and if the economists should rule the world, they will say that there are no need for any redress because the market will solve all the problem. I think the experience has shown that the market will solve some problems, but not all the problems. I mean, need of course political rights, not only on the national but also on the international level here. So that is why the voice of the Consumer International is important here in and dealing with let's understand that the standardization is one crucial element in the ISO standards and so on. That who should decide the standards? Is it a competition between businesses, or have the NGOs, consumer NGOs, or environmental NGOs a stake in this discussion? I see that it clearly has this, and also dealing with competition policy. So of course, India is a large country, and the consumer organizations are probably weak, as they are in most. But to listen to this voice, and I think it is important that to bring this in the political process, not only in dealing with trade policy and with the competition policy is crucial, I see it, and I think that most of us will understand that this was happening in India. This liberalization has been necessary, but as I understand it, this book, just briefing, looking at it, trying to find a new regulatory regime, so dealing that also the competition has to be regulated, and how do you deal with that, and what kind of instruments you have for taking care of the interests of normal citizens that are not only consumers but also trade unions and so on is also important in this matter. So this is a more political look at this competition discussion than just a mere economic.
Well, thank you for that. I don't think any economist today worth his ilk would say that markets could solve everything. Externalities, howsoever defined in itself, are part of the market failure. But we don't have the luxury, unfortunately, to continue this discussion without encroaching on the time allotted to the next session, and also some time for us to grab a cup of coffee. But what I wanted to end was to leave you with the thought that when we think about the framework of government policies, we think about the central bank as the repository for monetary policy. We think about the Ministry of Commerce or Trade, or however it's labeled, as being the department responsible for international trade. And we think about, ministries for industry as industry development and all. But we don't really have a ministry for competition as such, or a focal point for competition. Increasingly, competition authorities are becoming the voice for that, but then they have to be empowered so that their voices are heard. In the early stages of the revisions to the Canadian competition legislation, the clause was put in. The reason I'm mentioning Canada is that despite my Indian roots, I'm Canadian. And the journeys I made to Norway at the time when you were formulating your policies was because Norway, like Canada, was a small open economy, is a small open economy, and the problems that small open economies face with respect to competition are very different from that of large economies like the United States or the EU now. And so what we decided to do was to put a statutory right for the head of the competition agency to appear before any federal government tribunal or parliamentary committee, whether he's invited or not, to present the case for competition and try to put forward the view that would be sort of least damaging to competition while taking into account other social political objectives as possible. Without having that statutory right, competition authorities generally tend to get closeted out. And so I think in India, what the national competition policy is trying to drive at is to try to increase the statutory right and the voice of the competition authority in an economy where, frankly, lobbyists and incumbent stakeholders seem to wield much more influence over government than government departments themselves. So maybe we can continue over coffee. Thank you very much to the participants, the presenters, as well as the other discussants. Thank you.
Okay, so help yourself with some coffee, tea, or what?
No, I agree on this.
Investment and Enterprise Division of UNCTAD. So, please.
I don't like staying behind lecterns, but since they asked me to use the microphone, I will. However, if you want to take these seats, go ahead, so we have more of a roundtable feel. I mean, there's some chairs open, so please use them. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's my first time to Oslo, so it's a very impressive, interesting city. Having read lots of things about Norway over the years, when we study corporate social responsibility, Norway has a lot of lessons to teach the world. So it's interesting to be sort of in the ground zero for all of these lessons. It's also a great pleasure to be here at this event with CUTS, since we've been in dialogue for many years, and they've often invited me to events, but unfortunately my schedule didn't permit it. I'm very happy to be here at the launch of this new study they have, and we're going to hear in a minute about this study, about rethinking business responsibility in India, which focuses on the healthcare industry, the pharmaceutical and the private healthcare industry. And we'll have an extensive presentation on that in a minute, and then following that presentation, we'll have an open discussion. One of the key topic for this session, this next hour that we discuss this, is effective regulation for business to achieve sustainable development goals. I always think this topic itself, it reminds me of one of these university essay questions where you have that one sentence that's full of a lot of loaded terms, and you're asked to deconstruct it and explain it. We can have a long discussion just on the word effective. Effective for who and how? What does that mean? Regulation. I think this is something we'll hear about. It's certainly something discussed in the report, is how there are different forms of regulation, and also how you have public-private sector partnerships and regulation, co-regulation. This idea of sustainable development goals. What is sustainable development? How do you measure that? And who's it for? So this is a very big area. It's a huge subject. At UNCTAD, we wrote a paper on a similar area a couple of years ago for the G20, when we were looking at CSR standards around the world. We looked at a lot of voluntary initiatives, particularly these certifiable standards. You can think of things like Marine Stewardship Council, Forward Stewardship Council, these kinds of initiatives. We looked also at the role of government in these initiatives, how they interact together. This is part of this broader discussion about voluntary versus regulatory initiatives. Our recommendations at that time were largely focused on governments that they need to be involved in this space, that they need to be involved in the further development of a lot of what exists now as voluntary standards, that many voluntary standards have demonstrated a proof of concept. But if you look at the market share that they affect, it's still relatively small, with only a couple of exceptions. So the opportunity here is for governments to use the voluntary sector as a laboratory, an experimental laboratory, to see what works, and then borrow from that and scale it up. The other concept was about this mix of public-private sector regulatory initiatives, and that is where the public sector can have a strong role in scaling things up while still allowing the private sector, and by that I also mean the civil society community, to be directly involved in defining what a lot of these standards mean. We see that particularly in sustainability reporting spaces, where, for example, Sweden next door requires companies to report to GRI. So that is a public requirement, but the actual definition of the standard, the Global Reporting Initiative Sustainability Reporting Standard, is developed by civil society communities. So you can have these kind of hybrid approaches. One of the things that we're talking about, particularly in this year's World Investment Report, which will launch next Wednesday in the CSR section, is about the need for governments to be involved to really ensure certain core issues, particularly around public goods, are met. That while voluntary initiatives in industry are important and they should continue, they are insufficient in most areas. And many big companies are simply ill-equipped to deal with the complexities of the challenges they face. They are, however, key partners in any solution, but they are not the solution unto themselves. To take a step back when we think broadly about responsibility, there are positive and negative obligations. So, and regulating negative obligations is usually a lot easier than regulating positive obligations. A negative obligation is don't dump toxic waste in a river. Okay, so as long as you don't do that, you're all right. But a positive obligation, like make people healthier. How healthier? How many people? At what cost? There are limits to that. So this is particularly the focus of this CUT study on the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry is extremely interesting, not just because health is a core fundamental public good, and that in enough is worth a study, but because it also gets into an area that is very challenging in the field of corporate social responsibility, which is positive obligations. The simplest thing in corporate social responsibility is negative obligations. Don't torture people, don't pollute the environment, and don't break the law. But when you get into positive obligations, make the environment a better place, make cleaner technology. How do you do that? How do you regulate that even? Which, that's very difficult. So while, certainly from UNCTAD's perspective, we will advocate stronger regulations, particularly for core fundamental rights, we realize that you cannot regulate everything, and you probably wouldn't want to. But especially in the area of positive obligations, you have a very difficult time regulating things. You have to think about incentives and structures and so on to help to promote the delivery of these goods. So I won't take up too much more time because we want to hear about the study. I am impressed with the study. There was 3 key objectives of the study: to look at the role of different actors, both public and private, in this area, the key challenges and conflicts they face, and what I think is very interesting is the gaps between the intention of regulation and the implementation. That's certainly something I've seen over the years when we've done studies in other areas of regulation, where there can be enormous gaps between what is intended in the regulation and what actually comes out of it. And quite often people think that because there's a rule or because there's a law, then that means something's actually happening. But it's good to check, to see, is something actually happening? So I think this is an important area to see. It's, of course, we all know that you have unintended consequences of regulation. So it's also important for these kind of studies to check on those. And that finally, I think it's the intention of this study, and I certainly wish it luck in that regard, to create a policy dialogue around this subject. That, these are very complicated questions. They always say you can, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution. That's also wrong. I'm sure that the CUTs could have spent their time brainstorming a simple list of things that need to be fixed, and this is this policy recommendation, but that's not going to solve the discussion because it's a moving target. You could come back to this area a couple of years from now and some things would be the same, some things would be different. They need to create this ongoing dialogue that's committed to making improvements in this space. And addressing, and I'll end with this, addressing capacity building challenges. This is especially an issue when we talk about the regulation of complicated industries. Regulating some things that are simple to get our heads around, maybe a road or something like that, okay. But when we think about things like the pharmaceutical sector, the healthcare sector, it's not an accident that Transparency International rates the healthcare sector as one of the most corrupt industries in the world. But one of the key reasons it's corrupt is because it's difficult to understand. If your doctor gives you a pill and says it costs, X amount, what do you know? Have you any idea how much that would cost? If he sticks you in a giant machine and presses a button and then afterwards says, this is what the bill is, how do you know? You need to ask an engineer or a pharmacist or a scientist to give you an answer to these things. So think about the role of regulators in this space. How do they regulate these things? It requires specific knowledge, and that makes the challenge even greater. So I'll end there and ask Rajit to come and give us a presentation on the study.
Thank you, Anthony. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rajit Sengupta, and I'm here to present the findings, some of the findings of the report, the research that we did together with NUPI on exploring the interplay between business regulation and corporate conduct in India. The presentation basically is prepared. I'm representing a group of colleagues who did this study, and that's why you see those three names: Vikas Batham, Rijit, myself, and Vasanthi Srinivasan. We were the ones who did the empirical research, but we are also grateful to Jens Anvig, our friend from NUPI, and we ensured that he spent enough time in India by bringing him back. I think he went there 3 times and spent about on a total about a month, and I'm sure that a couple of times it was actually the middle of the summer, so that was a bad spot to be in. But then it was useful for him to be there. So I represent the whole team, and the report is a joint publication that we were able to release. What I'm going to do is basically talk about, cover 6 areas in my presentation. Talk to you very briefly about what drove us to undertake this research, in terms of the introduction. I'll also give you a brief overview of the research of the project itself. Talk a bit about some of the elements of this fairly complicated research, and we spent much more time in designing the methodology than we ever expected we would be. So it is important for us to share the outline of the methodology and some of the design aspects of it. Very briefly, talk about a few key findings. Of course, the book, as Anthony has sort of released, is here, and you're most welcome to pick up your own copy and take a look at the findings. And some of the emerging conclusions and the way forward. We intentionally did not, we resisted the temptation of making recommendations and prescriptions and providing judgments, because that was an advice that was given to us, given the complexity of the issue. Not only the issue, but also the sectors that we were dealing with. Some people said that you guys have really stick your neck out by looking at these 2 sectors who are extremely not only important but also even dangerous to talk about in India. So, what was the driving factor? Why were we even interested in looking at this issue? And one of them was the increasing role that the private sector was having in providing public goods in India. The issue of demand and supply was raised here in the earlier session, and it is real. It is impossible for the government to provide the public goods and services in India, given the volume of the market. So the private sector is playing a much greater role in providing some of these public goods, especially in sectors like agriculture, education, and healthcare. So it was important to understand and examine this role that the private sector has been playing in providing these public goods, especially given the regulatory architecture that we had and that we have in each of these sectors, and to understand whether the expectations that society has from private sector to play such a role are being met or not. We were lucky, we were extremely lucky when we were implementing this project that we started the project in March, and in June 2011, the government of India released the National Voluntary Guidelines on Social, Economic and Environmental Responsibilities of Business. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy with me, but it was for the first time that the government of India came up with a definition or a framework of how to define what is responsible business. Until that point in time, we did not have a definition. It was open to interpretation, it was open to practices by individual companies. So at least we were extremely lucky that we had a framework to assess and examine the private sector's role in providing these public goods and understand the role of regulation. As an organization, and this is pertaining to again another question that was raised, as a consumer organization, we have been extremely focused on playing a part in influencing or even shaping the regulatory reform agenda in some of the sectors. That is to respond to the point that Ivan raised in the first session. So we were extremely interested to understand what would be the nature and type of regulation that could have any implication on responsibility, given the new evolving framework of responsible business in India under the National Voluntary Guidelines, which is the NVGs. So we started this project in 2011, as I mentioned, and it was implemented in cooperation with NUPI and with support from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs through the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Delhi. The sectors, we actually spent almost 7 months trying to identify the sectors that we should be looking at, and also the states. Once we've identified the sectors, just to sort of convey the complexity that we were confronted with when we undertook this assignment. So these two sectors, the pharmaceutical sector and the private healthcare sector, were finally chosen after I think around 4 rounds of discussions involving stakeholders and key experts on the subject. And subsequently the states were also chosen: Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, Himachal Pradesh and West Bengal, 4 states in which we would do both secondary research and also the empirical primary research and analysis. I think Anthony has talked about some of the key objectives already, and it was really important for us to understand the regulatory and the operational constraints that businesses faced in these sectors, and not only that, but also to understand what were to isolate some of these factors that have implications on responsible business. We were also trying to understand and expand the whole thinking on responsible business, in the sense that when we talk about responsible business, often the discussion is restricted to either the industry or the sector. The internal elements, that the practices within the industry, the practices or actions by individual firms, which are intrinsic and internal to the sector, but we often neglect or forget the fact that the industry or the sector operates in the larger ecosystem, which has a large number of players and actors who have implications on how the industry behaves, how each firm behaves, how the associations behave. So the first thing that we wanted to do is to also do a mapping of the various actors and see how each of them sort of played their own roles in the overall system, put them together into the canvas. And then the other issue was also to understand, these two sectors, and I'll come to in the next few slides about the nature of the regulatory framework of these two sectors. The idea was also to understand the gap. What intention did the government have in developing the kind of regulatory framework that we see today in these two sectors? And has the intention been met by the kind of implementation that we can see right now? Or are there gaps? What do those gaps tell us? What lessons can we derive for the future? In terms of typology and from a clarificatory angle, we wanted to specifically deal with these two issues that we are looking at. One was the idea of business regulation, and the other was the issue of corporate conduct or business responsibility. Now, when we started looking at business regulation vis-a-vis its implication on firm behavior or performance, then we saw that there are three elements of business regulation, and it has to be looked at from that perspective. So there was the issue of public regulation, and often discussion on business regulation remains restricted to public regulation only, which is the actions by the government. We often forget the two other important elements of regulation: co-regulation, which is regulation which can be done maybe at the level of the sector association, business associations, and self-regulation, which is at the level of the industry, at the level of the individual firms. So we wanted to understand all three elements of regulation from vis-a-vis responsible business in this sector. We are also conscious of the fact that in these two sectors, specifically pharmaceuticals and private healthcare, given the federal system of administrations of rules or regulations in India, policies are developed at the national level, but their implementation actually happens at the states. The states have the responsibility of implementing policies in the healthcare sector and also in the pharmaceutical segment of policies which are developed at the national level. So we wanted to understand those variations across the states, whether if there was a uniform and the same regulation and rules, can we expect the same or uniform output if we have different states, approaching the rules differently? Talking about responsible business, as I said, the National Voluntary Guidelines gave us a framework of 9 core principles and 48 core elements of how to define responsible business. And what we did was we basically juxtaposed those 48 core elements on the life cycle of the two sectors, from manufacturing to the consumer's end for pharmaceutical, and again from sort of manufacturing or operating or provisioning to the consumer end in case of private healthcare. And you can find that there is an annexure in the report where we have tried to sort of present that analysis on page 142, where we've taken a look at all those we've analyzed those core elements and those principles across the pharmaceutical and the private healthcare sector, and which has helped us in identifying the critical elements that we would be doing research on. A little bit about the research design. As I've already indicated, the states were Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, Himachal Pradesh, and West Bengal, 4 different states in India. And the sectoral analysis framework, which is just what I've explained right now, were able to help us in identifying that, from a responsible business perspective, there were 2 critical elements in both these 2 sectors. One was their performance their environmental performance, number 1, and secondly, the element of marketing and distribution of the products and services, and the whole ethical element in it. The framework as such that basically we were saying that regulation of the sector, of a particular sector, was undertaken with the main goal of achieving a certain type of outcome, which was, say, responsible business, and the degree or the nature of output was determined by the enforcement, the quality of enforcement, the institution which was important for implementation of that reforms. And it was not a system which was straightforward. There were other critical elements which had implications, especially in the area of enforcement, which determined the ultimate level of output or outcome, which was the type of behavior of firms in the market. So it was important for us to understand what were those critical factors which played a role in the sphere of enforcement of those regulations that would lead to those kind of outputs in terms of corporate conduct. And this helped us in framing the questions and developing the outline for undertaking the fieldwork in the states. As far as the critical elements were concerned, in these two sectors, as I have already indicated, we were looking at the environmental performance of these sectors firstly, and secondly, we are looking at marketing and distribution. And these were the issues, the questions, the environmental impacts of manufacturing in the pharmaceutical sector, the whole area of biomedical waste management in private healthcare. In marketing and distribution, it was the incentive structures in terms of the promotion of drugs and marketing of drugs. And secondly, in the area of private healthcare, it was the standard treatment protocol, the rational use of drugs, and those elements that we were dealing with. Now, what I have next are a few selected. I didn't want to, make it too long, so I've got a very few selected findings which I'm going to present now for both the pharmaceutical sector and the private healthcare sector. From this slide and the figures, it is pretty evident that the firm surveyed had a huge amount, had much more confidence in the ability of the board, which is basically a self-regulatory element in dealing with or improving the environmental performance of the firms, vis-a-vis the role of the government. So when it comes to environmental performance of firms, at least in these states, it was very clear that they had much more reliance on self-regulatory ways of dealing with it. Of course, it is a challenge. We know, some of us who deal with this issue, is that to bring the attention to the board is another challenge. But that was something that people said that was the only way of, or probably the best way of improving the environmental performance, was to make environmental issues or environmental performance an item in the discussion in boardrooms of pharmaceutical firms. When we looked at the support that firms expected from the government, we saw that there was some variation in states, and some states had much more expectation from the government than the others. And one of the reasons which we thought was important, and of course we need a little bit more deeper investigation, is the history of business in that state. Some states have a fairly long history of business, and it seems that those states don't really have a lot of confidence on the government's ability to, or the government support to help them improve their on their responsibility quotient, whereas some of the states which are newer, which have a sort of a much shorter or recent history of doing business, have a much more higher expectation of support, receiving support from the government, and they have been receiving that sort of support from the government because those states, for example, Himachal Pradesh, that state has been receiving huge amount of support from the government in order to improve the industry in that state. Tax incentives, blah, 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 were being provided. So the industry was pretty confident that it will continue to receive that sort of support from the government as well. The other interesting finding was that only a few, when it comes to regulating for responsibility, it was very few firms from most of the states which were in favor of government actions for improving their responsibility quotient in the pharmaceutical sector. So we were wondering, what story emerges from this is basically there in the pharmaceutical sector. The firms have much greater confidence, largely, on undertaking self-regulatory measures towards improving their responsibility. So we then thought about let us see if there is any support which is being provided by the associations, because we were also, on one hand, we were looking at public regulation, but we were also wanting to understand if co-regulation can actually have any impact. And we saw that the level of support that pharmaceutical firms were receiving from the sectoral associations, various pharmaceutical associations across the states were different. In some states, like in Andhra Pradesh and in Himachal Pradesh, they were getting a lot of support from the pharmaceutical associations. But in some of the others, like in Gujarat and West Bengal, they were not. And it is also interesting the way the pharmaceutical associations are structured in India. If you look at the pharmaceutical associations, there is an Apex Pharmaceutical Association which has a headquarter either in Delhi or in Bombay, which is the policy setting and body. But they also have state-level associations in most of the states where they have a manufacturing base. However, when it comes to any action that has to be undertaken, whether it's in line in terms of improving the capacity, whether it's capacity building, whether it's improving the ability of a certain section of the members on responsible business, all those decisions are taken by the apex body. So the state level associations, as far as the governance is concerned, as far as their interaction with the members are concerned, is very, very weak. Switching over to the private healthcare sector, and I must say that our study in the private healthcare has really, sort of helped us in developing some deeper understanding on one area, which is a new market probably emerging, which is the biomedical waste management services market. The regulation, the biomedical waste management rules was developed in 1998, and there was an amendment in 2000 and 2011. There's another amendment. So it's in the in the sphere of environmental performance of firms, private hospitals, it is one of the newest sort of regulatory. It is one of the newest rules which has helped the states develop the market, and there are private companies which are engaged in providing biomedical waste management services. But it seems that across the states there was a huge amount of variation in how states have responded to this area of biomedical waste management. While some states were fairly aware and were submitting their reports on time, some were not that well. Awareness was pretty good, but the reporting, etc., to the state pollution control boards was not that well developed. The other interesting issue that we saw in terms of the biomedical waste management services across the states was that in some states, like in Andhra Pradesh and Gujarat, where you had a huge private healthcare market, they were able to develop the market by engaging different companies to service different districts, actually different towns, and that helped them in developing the market. However, if you look at a state like West Bengal, which also had, well, not that much, but pretty large number of private hospitals, there were only 2 biomedical waste management companies which had been engaged. So we feel that there is a market definitely which can be developed in this area, and that is something that the government should really sort of look at. And that is the kind of role, Anthony, the government should play, when you talk about responsibility. The biomedical waste management services, if it is improved, will have an implication on the responsibility of a private healthcare towards society in terms of dealing with the waste, which can be infectious and can be a public health hazard. So the government should develop some sort of a model of engagement of private sector in dealing with this issue, dealing with biomedical waste. That's what we thought was a possible way forward. The other interesting finding was that when it comes to hospital associations, I spoke about I spoke about pharmaceutical associations and that fact that there is an apex body and there are state level chapters. In case of hospital associations, it was only state driven. We don't have something like a National Association of Private Hospitals of India. We don't. We only have state-level private hospital associations, and that too, in some states we have them, and in others we don't. Like for example, in Gujarat, in spite of the fact that there are 500 odd private hospitals, then there is no private hospital association. So any discussion on responsibility or any discussion on improvement of the sector's performance need to be channeled in a different manner in a state which does not have such a platform, of sectoral associations. So what we feel would be useful is for the government and the private sectors to come together and try to understand if at all there is a need for developing an association in the state of Gujarat, so that it probably becomes easier for the government to deal with the 500 odd private hospitals that the state has. The other thing that we found was in terms of the hospitals, that only a handful of private hospitals had some control over the prescription that their doctors were, on the prescription of the doctors. And the reason were diverse. We spoke to some doctors, and they said that it is very difficult for the institution to have that sort of a standard because different doctors have different levels of confidence on different drugs, and it is not often the case that a doctor would recommend a generic drug or a non-branded drug because his level of confidence because of practice is much more on a branded drug as compared to a generic drug. But some hospitals have started discussing with the doctors about the possibility of having some sort of a standard protocol, a standard treatment protocol. The discussion has progressed much more in some states, like in West Bengal. There is a standard treatment protocol guideline which has been issued by the government of West Bengal for public healthcare providing hospitals, for public hospitals, and there is some discussion about trying to replicate that model or adopt that model for the private healthcare hospitals. We'll have to see how that discussion progresses and if there is any uptake of that template that has been developed for the public hospital within the private sector. So what are some of the emerging conclusions? And we've arranged them into two sections: the micro level and some macro level. Now, one of the emerging conclusion is that as far as legislations are concerned and their awareness is concerned, it is fairly okay as far as both the pharmaceutical and the private healthcare sectors are concerned, but the compliance is often very weak. The sector, both the sectors have a fairly high amount of expectation from the government when it comes to capacity building, training, and support, especially financial support. Biomedical waste management services is an area which is emerging, and the government has to mostly at the national and to a certain extent at the state level, the government has to start thinking about how to develop this market in a better manner, so that there is some private participation, greater private participation in this sector, which can lead to favorable outcomes. We also had discussions with what are called medical sales representatives. This is basically a fleet of professionals who either work independently or are under a certain for every large and medium pharmaceutical company have a fleet of professionals who they sent out to go and have discussions with doctors in order to tell them of the usage of a drug, of what medicine to be made available, and the conditions of service of these medical sales representatives is something that the government needs to really examine, because one, they have extremely high sales target. So it is not something, it is purely based on commercial returns, the conditions of service. So if the medical sales representative is able to meet a certain target, he then gets benefits. So he or she does not have a fixed salary. His salary is probably 50%, and the rest 50% is on meeting targets. So if you meet targets, you have a commission. So the medical sales representative has an incentive of pushing through drugs, through the doctors, and that has, as you can understand, implication on the quality and quantity of drugs which is available at the consumer's end, and that is a real concern. When it comes to the interaction between regulators and firms, the information exchange or the transmission of information between the regulators and the firms and vice versa is pretty weak and erratic. And there's no institutional process of to drive those discussions, to drive that information flow. We also saw that, in case of both private healthcare and pharmaceuticals, there are regulators in the law. The law makes it important for regulators to cooperate. However, there is hardly any evidence of, or any method or any conduit for such cooperation to have happen in the state level. We were not able to identify any of them. So one, the regulatory framework is very fragmented, and secondly, the coordination of regulators who have a common responsibility